If you carried a BAR in the Pacific, you were a marked man. The Japanese knew exactly what that weapon could do to a charging line of infantry, and they learned to shoot the BAR gunner first every single time. But the story of this weapon actually began for a completely different reason in a completely different war. But before the BAR would terrify Japanese soldiers across the Pacific, it's worth understanding why this weapon was created in such a unique way in the first place. Because the role it was designed for and the role it actually played turned out to be two very different things. When the First World War ground to a halt in the trenches, infantry faced a problem that nobody could solve. You see, at this point in history, the standard infantry weapon was still the bolt-action rifle. A soldier could fire maybe 15 aimed shots per minute if he was well trained. And after each shot, he had to manually cycle the bolt to chamber the next round. Now, this was fine for aimed fire at range, but it created a devastating problem when you needed to cross open ground. If your men stopped to shoot, they became stationary targets for enemy artillery and machine guns. But if they kept moving without shooting, enemy defenders could set up their own machine guns and cut them down anyway. Artillery bombardments could pound enemy positions for hours, forcing defenders into their bunkers. But that fire had to stop before friendly troops went over the top. And in the gap between when the guns went quiet and when attackers actually reached the enemy trench, defenders would crawl out of their holes, set up their weapons, and slaughter everyone caught in the open. What infantry desperately needed was automatic fire that could move with the assault, something that would let soldiers keep shooting while they advanced, keeping enemy heads down during those critical seconds of exposure. You couldn't just stop and set up a firing line because that bunched men together into easy targets, and heavier machine guns existed, but dragging a water-cooled Maxim across no man's land simply wasn't realistic. The French attempted a solution with the Chauchat automatic rifle. The tactical concept actually proved sound, showing that a single soldier really could carry automatic firepower forward during an attack. But the weapon itself was awkward and unreliable, and American troops who received versions rechambered for the .30-06 cartridge had constant problems with them. So while the French had shown what was possible, they hadn't built the right tool for the job. The task of creating something better fell to John Browning, the most accomplished firearms designer in American history. And through years of development and refinement, he would eventually produce a weapon unlike anything that existed at the time. What he couldn't possibly know was how far his creation would travel, eventually ending up in the jungles of the Pacific against an enemy on the other side of the world that he never could have imagined facing. The Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, was chambered in the standard .30-06 cartridge, weighed around 16 pounds, and fed from a 20-round box magazine. But understanding what made this weapon special requires understanding exactly what problem it was built to solve. The Army developed something called walking fire doctrine, specifically around the BAR. The idea was that soldiers equipped with these new automatic rifles would advance toward enemy positions while firing, primarily from the hip and primarily in semi-automatic mode. You weren't trying to hit specific targets at this point, you just wanted enough rounds going down range to force every defender to keep his head down while your assault line closed the distance. Unlike bolt-action rifles that required manual cycling after each shot, the BAR let a man keep walking and keep shooting without breaking stride. Browning even designed the weapon's controls around this concept. The fire selector was intentionally stiff, requiring real effort to move, sometimes needing 2 fingers. It traveled from safe, forward to semi-automatic, then forward again to full automatic. A spring-loaded stop made switching from semi to auto easy. But returning to safe required deliberate force, so a soldier switching modes under stress couldn't accidentally flip to safe and find his rifle dead at the worst moment. The BAR came with purpose-built web gear too. The gunner's belt had a metal cup mounted on the right side, designed specifically to support the buttstock while firing from the hip on the move. So this wasn't something men improvised in the field, because hip firing while advancing was official Army doctrine with dedicated equipment to make it work. First combat came in September 1918, just weeks before the armistice. But the BAR never really got to prove itself in the role it was designed for. General Pershing was worried that deploying the weapon in small numbers would let Germans capture examples and potentially reverse engineer them. He wanted to field the BAR in massive numbers all at once, equipping entire divisions simultaneously rather than letting it trickle into combat. The plan was to unleash it during the expected 1919 spring offensives, but the war ended before that could happen. So the BAR went into storage without ever being tested at scale for the walking fire tactics it was specifically created for. And then something unexpected happened during the interwar years. Those 50,000 BARs sitting in National Guard armories across America became targets for criminals. Guard facilities had part-time staff and weaker security. And during Prohibition's most violent years, some of the country's most notorious outlaws took full advantage. Clyde Barrow made the BAR his signature weapon, preferring it over the Thompson's submachine gun because the .30-06 cartridge could punch through the body panels of 1930s automobiles, something the Thompson's .45 caliber rounds couldn't reliably do. In 1933, Clyde and his brother broke into an armory in Oklahoma and stole 5 BARs along with thousands of rounds of ammunition. He modified his stolen weapons by cutting down the barrels and stocks, creating something compact and devastating. When Bonnie and Clyde were finally ambushed in 1934, their car contained 3 full-auto BARs and 100 loaded magazines. These shootouts, where criminals outgunned police with military weapons, led directly to new federal legislation that imposed a $200 tax on automatic weapons, which in 1934, money was enough to put them out of reach for most people. Colt responded by developing a shorter, lighter version called the R80 Monitor, specifically for law enforcement, featuring an 18-inch barrel that brought the weight down to just 14 pounds. By the late 1930s, with another war looking inevitable, the Army decided to update the design for the conflict ahead. The result was the M1918A2, and the modifications reflected a completely different vision of what the weapon should be. They eliminated semi-automatic fire entirely, replacing it with 2 automatic settings: a slow rate using a hydraulic buffer mechanism and a faster rate without it. They added a bipod that mounted at the muzzle, a flash suppressor, and a hinged buttstock rest, and the original 16 pounds grew to nearly 20. What the Army was trying to do was transform the BAR into a light machine gun, but they never addressed the fundamental limitation that separated it from true light machine guns like the British Bren or German MG-34. During sustained fire, barrels overheat and accuracy degrades. So proper light machine guns let crews swap barrels in seconds, while the BAR required armourer-level disassembly that was completely impractical in combat. Belgian manufacturer FN actually offered the Army a quick-change barrel design in 1938 and 1939, but the Army turned it down because it wouldn't fit existing receivers. That decision meant American soldiers would fight the entire next war with a weapon that had one hand tied behind its back when it came to sustained fire. And that original walking fire doctrine, it turned out to be completely useless in the Pacific. You couldn't march across open ground, firing from the hip when you could barely see 10 yards through the jungle vegetation. Japanese positions were dug into caves and fortified bunkers that you often didn't spot until you were right on top of them. So American troops arrived in the Pacific with a weapon designed for the trenches of France, modified into something that wasn't quite a light machine gun, being thrown into a fight nobody had planned for. Once soldiers hit the reality of jungle combat, they dropped the Army's improvements almost immediately, stripping off the bipods and flash suppressors to get the weight back down and using the guns the way Browning had intended them in the first place. Training doctrine established the BAR as the squad's primary automatic weapon, operated by a 3-man team. The gunner carried around 220 rounds in 11 magazines. The assistant gunner carried extra ammunition and was trained to grab the weapon and keep firing the moment the primary gunner went down. And everyone in the squad learned the basics of operating the weapon because the Army expected BAR gunners to become casualties at a much higher rate than regular riflemen. Post-war analysis estimated that the average combat lifespan of a BAR gunner was roughly 30 minutes once shooting started. If you eliminated the man with the automatic rifle, you crippled an entire squad's ability to lay down suppressive fire, so every enemy who spotted an American infantry unit knew exactly who to shoot first. Reports from the Pacific confirmed this, noting that in all engagements, the enemy constantly gave priority attention to the BAR. Now, to understand why Japanese soldiers came to hate this weapon so much, you need to understand what they were carrying and how differently their squads were organized. The Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns were the closest thing the Japanese had to the BAR, but they weren't really the same class of weapon at all. These were crew-served light machine guns based on the Czech ZB-26 design, requiring a dedicated team to operate effectively. The Type 96 held 30 rounds compared to the BAR's 20, and both Japanese guns had something American gunners desperately wanted: quick-change barrels that let crews swap out overheated barrels in seconds and keep shooting. But here's what's interesting about the Japanese approach. They never developed anything like the BAR, a true squad automatic weapon that one soldier could carry and operate independently. They never fielded submachine guns in any significant numbers either. The Type 100 was Japan's only submachine gun of the war, and production was so limited that most Japanese soldiers never saw one. Their standard infantry weapon remained the bolt-action Arisaka rifle, and their entire tactical doctrine was built around a very different philosophy than the Americans. A typical Japanese squad of 13 to 15 men, organized entirely around supporting that single crew-served light machine gun. 4 men operated the gun itself, and the remaining riflemen existed primarily to carry ammunition and protect the gun team until they could close with the enemy for the final bayonet charge. Japanese doctrine emphasized getting inside the enemy's firepower advantage as quickly as possible and finishing the fight by hand. The machine gun provided suppression, while riflemen closed the distance. The American approach evolved in exactly the opposite direction. By 1944, Marine squads had 3 4-man fire teams, and each fire team had its own BAR. Where a Japanese squad lost all automatic fire capability if their single light machine gun went down, a Marine squad that lost 1 BAR still had 2 more. The mathematics of redundancy worked in American favor every single time. This drove a dramatic increase in BARs per Marine division throughout the war. In 1943, a division had about 500 BARs, but by 1945 that number had grown to over 860, a nearly 70% increase driven directly by combat experience. Marines learned that they needed automatic rifles distributed across the squad rather than concentrated in a single weapon, and they needed every man trained to pick one up when the gunner went down. Captured Japanese documents acknowledged that American divisions possessed 5 to 6 times the firepower of Japanese divisions when naval and air support were included. Their response was to emphasize surprise, night operations, and closing distance as quickly as possible before American automatic weapons could do their work. But getting inside that perimeter meant crossing ground covered by men with BARs. Guadalcanal showed what happened when they tried. At the Battle of Tenaru in August 1942, around 900 Japanese soldiers charged a sandbar position where Marines had established interlocking fields of fire. BARs complemented the heavier machine guns, filling gaps and covering blind spots across the approach. By morning, roughly 800 Japanese were dead against 44 Marines killed. On Saipan in July 1944, over 4,000 Japanese soldiers launched what would become the largest banzai charge of the war. They struck before dawn, and the fighting continued for 12 hours. Weapons fired continuously, no longer in short bursts, with gunners swinging their barrels left and right across the charging mass. Even as bodies piled up in front of American positions, the Japanese kept coming, climbing over their own dead. When it was over, more than 4,000 Japanese had been killed. And there were soldiers who earned the highest military honors with their BARs, coupling the weapon with a level of bravery that's hard to comprehend. Private Wilson Watson on Iwo Jima charged a series of fortified pillboxes alone, firing into the openings and throwing grenades. The next day, when his platoon was pinned at the base of a ridge, he climbed the slope under mortar and machine gun fire, then stood fully exposed on the crest and fired from the hip. He held that position for 15 minutes, killing 60 Japanese before his ammunition was nearly gone. He was shot 7 times and took mortar fragments in the shoulder, and when he checked his magazines afterward, he found only 2 rounds remaining. In Manila, 2 BAR gunners, named Clyde Rodriguez and John Reese, found their platoon pinned 100 yards from a railroad station defended by 300 Japanese Marines. They grabbed every grenade and magazine they could carry and sprinted through enemy fire to a building 60 yards from the objective. For over an hour, they engaged targets of opportunity, killing over 35 enemy soldiers. And when they spotted Japanese soldiers moving toward defensive positions, they killed another 40 before they could reach cover. When their ammunition was nearly gone, they withdrew by alternating cover for each other. Reese was killed by a sniper while reloading his weapon, telling Rodriguez to go first because he had a family waiting for him. Both men received the Medal of Honor, with Reese's awarded posthumously. By the final campaigns, something had shifted in Japanese tactics. Banzai charges became increasingly rare, and on Peleliu and Okinawa, Japanese garrisons chose to fight from fortified positions rather than mass in the open. General Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima explicitly prohibited banzai charges, calling them a waste of manpower. This was a complete rejection of traditional Japanese offensive doctrine, driven by what happened every time massed infantry tried to rush through American automatic weapons fire. The BAR remained in service long after the Pacific War ended, seeing combat in Korea and reportedly being carried by some units into the early years of Vietnam. The M60 machine gun finally replaced it in 1957, nearly 4 decades after John Browning first built his automatic rifle for the trenches of France. He designed it to solve a very specific problem in a very specific war, never imagining it would end up on Pacific islands, in frozen Korean mountains, and in Southeast Asian jungles.